Okay, so we all think we know the story, right? Two brothers, a windy beach, and that first flight that changed everything. It's a tale that feels practically baked into our history books. But what if I told you that simple, clean story, well, it isn't the whole story? What if the very idea of who was first is way more complicated, more passionate, and honestly, a lot more global than we've been led to believe? Let's get into it.
Because as soon as you start digging, this is the big question that just smacks you right in the face. And you quickly realize the answer really depends on who you ask, and maybe more importantly, what you actually mean by the word fly.
At first glance, the dates seem pretty open and shut. You've got 1903 for the Wrights in America and 1906 for the Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos Dumont in Paris. But just look at the descriptions underneath. The Wrights claim the first controlled, powered flight. Santos Dumont's supporters, on the other hand, champion his as the first unassisted, self-propelled flight. And that tiny difference in wording, that is the seed of a fierce, century-long debate.
So let's break this down, because it really forces us to ask a pretty fundamental question. What does it actually take to be considered the very first to fly? All right, here's the version we all know. December 17th, 1903. The Wrights make 4 flights. The longest one lasts just under a minute. It was powered, it was controlled, and it was sustained. But, and these are some big buts, their plane was launched from a rail, and it needed a strong wind blowing at it to even get off the ground. Plus, the only people who saw it happen were a handful of friends and locals. Okay, now let's jump over to Paris 3 years later. You have Alberto Santos Dumont, who flies his aircraft in front of a huge public crowd. His flight was officially certified by the biggest aviation authority in the world at the time, and here's the kicker. His plane took off using its own power, on wheels, from a standstill. No rails, no catapults, no special wind needed. For his supporters, this wasn't just a flight, it was the first true flight of a real airplane. And believe me, people get really passionate about this. This comment pretty much sums up the pro-Dumont argument. The idea is that using a rail and wind is basically just a fancy glide. It's not flying. A real airplane, they say, has to be able to get off the ground all by itself. But the Wrights defenders have a pretty powerful comeback. They say, okay, fine, forget 1903 for a second. Because by 1904, the brothers were already doing things like flying in a complete circle, staying in the air for 5 minutes straight, and covering almost 3 miles. I mean, these were incredible feats of sustained, controlled flight, and they happened a full 2 years before Santos Dumont's public flight in Paris.
So you see, this isn't just about looking at a calendar. It's a much deeper question about what an invention even is. Is it the very first time something kind of works, even if it needs help and no one sees it? Or is it the first time it's proven to work for real, out in the open, for everyone to see?
But wait, the plot thickens. It turns out the complexity doesn't stop with the inventors. The very explanation of how an airplane flies, the one a lot of us learned in school, that's also wrapped up in its own fascinating myth. You've definitely seen this diagram, right? It's called the equal transit time theory. It's a nice, simple story. Air splits at the front of the wing. Because the top is curved, it's longer, so the air on top has to travel faster to meet up with the air from the bottom at the exact same time. Faster air means lower pressure, and boom, lift. It's elegant and makes sense. And it's also just not true at all. When scientists actually test this in wind tunnels, the air moving over the top gets to the back of the wing way before the air on the bottom does. They don't meet up at the same time. So if the most common explanation for lift is wrong, where in the world did it come from? Well, the answer takes us way back to the 18th century with a mathematical model called potential flow. See, long before anyone flew, thinkers were trying to figure out how fluids move. To make the math easier, they just imagined a perfect fluid, one that has no friction, no stickiness.
This perfect fluid model is exactly where the equal transit time idea comes from. But here's the hilarious part. That same simplified math also predicts that a wing should have 0 lift and 0 drag. An airplane shouldn't be able to fly at all. It was such a famous problem, it was called D'Alembert's paradox. So, that myth we all learned, it's basically a ghost haunting us from a 250-year-old mathematical shortcut that doesn't work in the real world.
So, we've seen that the story of who is first is complicated. The story of how we fly is based on a myth. It just goes to show you that, at its heart, the story of flight is really a story about people. And one of the most incredible yet overlooked chapters of this human story takes us all the way to Indonesia. I want to introduce you to a man named B.J. Habibie. In the 1970s, he was given the monumental task of building an entire aircraft industry from scratch. But he didn't see it as just a manufacturing problem. For him, this was a massive nationwide education project.
And you don't have to take my word for it. His own engineers said it best. They said that working at the state aircraft company felt like they were in school. They were working, yeah, but they were always learning. And Habibie was their teacher. This idea of a leader being a teacher, that was his whole philosophy.
Now, this is the key thing to understand. For Habibie, the airplane itself was almost a byproduct. The real goal was to build up the skills, the knowledge, the confidence, and the technological mastery of a whole generation of Indonesians.
And this really unique way of thinking, it led to some absolutely astounding results. It wasn't just about building a company. It was about building a nation's capability.
So he founded the company in 1976. And get this, in less than 20 years, on August 10th, 1995, they achieved something that many thought was impossible. They had the maiden flight of the N250, an aircraft designed from top to bottom by Indonesian engineers.
And the N250 wasn't just some copycat plane. It was a technological masterpiece. It was the world's very first turboprop to use fly-by-wire controls, which made it the most advanced aircraft in its entire class. At that point, only giants like Airbus and Boeing had pulled that tech off. It was such a monumental achievement that the anniversary is now a national holiday in Indonesia.
And the rest of the world definitely took notice. The legendary CEO of General Electric, Jack Welch, actually told Habibie that what he'd accomplished, building this industry from nothing in a developing nation, was at least as difficult as the Americans putting a man on the moon. Just let that sink in. So, we've got a bitter rivalry over who was first, a scientific myth that just won't die, and an incredible story about building a nation's spirit through technology. So what does it all mean? What is the real story of flight?
I think this quote about B.J. Habibie just says it all. The airplane is a marvel, for sure. But the ultimate achievement isn't the machine itself. It's the human capacity to dream it, to build it, to understand it. The greatest invention isn't really the plane, it's the people who can make one.
The simple story is rarely the whole story. The story of flight is one of fierce arguments, stubborn myths, and incredible human development. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other stories of great inventions have we just accepted as simple facts? And what amazing human achievements are we missing because we're only looking at the final product?